Hello, hello everybody, and welcome. We're just welcoming participants into the room, and the numbers are counting up steadily. Just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. It is such a pleasure to see you again. Even though I can't see you directly, I know that you're there, and I met so many of you recently, and thank you so much for joining us again today. So many of you know who I am, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to tell you again. My name's Catherine Sykes, and I am one of the chairs of the Crisis Communications Network. You'll see Chris Tucker here. She is the other chair. And the network has 900 members and 2,500 followers on LinkedIn. And as such, we are one of the CPR's biggest and most popular networks, which is fantastic. This year alone, we have welcomed nearly 1,400 attendees to our events. And so far this year, this is our second most attended event. In fact, it's our second most attended event ever. So there's a lot of interest in this subject, crisis communication and social media. So I do hope you'll find it very interesting. Thank you again, all of you, for coming today. It's terrific. Now, those of you who've been to a network event before, and I think many of you have, you will know that our purpose in life is to promote excellence and share best practice in crisis communications. And one of the ways we do this is to put together publications. Today we are launching our second ever publication, and this is Crisis Communication and Social Media. So it is a really special day for us because we are very proud of this publication. We think it's absolutely fantastic. It's the work of the whole committee over several months, and it's been led and directed by Felix Osman, you'll see on your screen, who's part of our committee. We've also are delighted to have had some really important contributions from leading practitioners in their field. You'll see Lucy Selvage on your screen, who is a leading practitioner, and she's also a past committee member. So we're grateful to you for joining us, Lucy, today as well. Everybody here today will receive a copy of the guide. It will also be available on the CIPR website, and it will also be available on our own website. It's there at the moment, and we'll just put a link to that in the chat for you as well. Today's event is worth 5 CPD points for CIPR members, and it is being recorded now, so you can watch it again later if you'd like to. Now, today's event is a launch. So what that means is that the members of the network will make a series of short presentations, which will just take you through the guide. It isn't a substitute for reading the guide itself, but hopefully it will signpost you to what the guide is and what it's trying to achieve. There will be a short Q&A session as well. So I would encourage you to use the chat box for your comments and observations, and put any questions you may have in the Q&A, and then we'll pick those up later. So that's all for me for now. I'd like to hand you over to Felix, who will lead today's session. Felix.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and hi to everyone out there. My name is Felix. As said, I am the event manager of the committee, as well as, and on the other side, my main job is I'm working as a PR manager at IKEA, the home furniture company. And I'm so excited to launch this guide today. It's been many months of work doing this guide. I think you shouldn't praise the guide already. You can do it yourself. It's about 30 pages long, and we've tried to pack it with good information that can be used for all of you. But let's jump into it. So the guide, we know that social media has made our work go so much quicker, it goes bigger, and crisis just gets so easily global. And I think, at least I can talk for myself, it sometimes feels so overwhelming with crisis communication and social media. And we often comment into this like perspective of, is just a threat. It's just so disturbing from what we are doing. What we have tried to do with this guide is, of course, include all of that, but also see it from different other perspectives. Because we also know that social media is such a great opportunity for us as crisis practitioners to react much quicker, to get our messages out there quicker, to understand what is saying out there much better, and also to predict when a crisis is about to happen, and hopefully be able to mitigate them before they're out there. And we also think that if we aren't prepared, if we have a strategic plan of how we're working with social media and crisis communication before it hits, it's also such a great place where we can communicate and talk with our stakeholders directly in an unmediated way. Before you're reading this guide, if you haven't already, please read our first guide, Drafting a Crisis Communication Plan. It's available through our website and also through the CIPR's official website. And this is a place where we are giving advice on how you can do the overarching crisis communication plan. If you don't have this in place, it will be very hard working on social media, because social media needs to be part of this one. So if you haven't already, download it and read it. So what do we mean with social media? It is a place that is constantly evolving. We know there's new platforms emerging all the time. It's so hard to know what's up trending at the moment. Different audiences are on different platforms. So therefore, in this guide, we define social media as a platforms where people can interact digitally, either publicly or privately, with a group of people. So for example, it can be a TikTok video, it can be a group message in a WhatsApp group, or Telegram, it can be a text message on LinkedIn. This guide doesn't provide with advice on X or Twitter, you should be doing this, you should say this, or you can use those functions. Or on LinkedIn, you can do those options. This guide doesn't talk about what you can do on different channels, how you're using them. These are taking a more strategic perspective of how you can use social media widely as platforms to use. Because every one of your organizations where you're working, where you're as individuals, will so much depend on how you would use this. The guide has been structured in the 5 different stages of a crisis. You will find even more about those 5 different stages in our first guide, and we've also included some information about it in this guide. But there are 5 sections. The first one is mitigate. How can you, before a crisis hits, use social media to both understand when something is about to happen and make sure that you handle it before it happens? How can you prepare? What do you need from a crisis communications plan? What do you need from a messaging perspective? How do you do all of that? We have ramp up. How can you, with help of social media, understand when something is about to happen? And really understand before you're coming into that full crisis mode, jump on the ship and try to handle the crisis when it is. Often a stage where most people doesn't really think about it, that they forget. Manage when you are in the fan, when everything is blowing, when it's so much to do. How do you manage social media? What do you need to think about? And lastly, and absolutely not to forget, recovery. We will go through very high level each of those sections in a moment, which will be done through myself and some of my other colleagues. You will see we have this little wheel, so hopefully you'll be able to navigate VR at the moment when we're talking. And as said, if you have any comments, thoughts, please put them in the chat. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We will also jump in with some different interview sections about some different things in between. You will see that will come. So, first section, mitigate. And this is probably something that where social media offers so much opportunities to really understand how can you ensure that you know that a crisis is about to happen, ensure that you don't want it. So things to think about and mitigate that you will find in the guide. So how do you listen to what's being said out there? Some of you might have budget for big fancy tools to do that, but also if you're on a very limited budget, how can you try to crawl and circulate out what's being said on social media to understand what's being said there? Second, very important, how do you secure access to your platforms? Many organizations doesn't really secured, and we can create crises just by ourselves and internal threats by not having our account secured. And lastly, which comes back to all of the basic of the crisis communications, how do you manage your community on social media when you're not in a crisis? What are you thinking? Because we know that brand building and having a strong brand is so helpful when you are in a crisis. So how do you take care of your community on social media day to day? Also, what channels do you communicate with them so that you're managed to communicate with them when you're coming in to when you are in a crisis? And with that, I'm handing over to the next section, Prepare, and Sarah.
Thanks, Felix. So first of all, hello to everybody. I'm Sarah Naylor. I'm one of the committee members, and it's my pleasure actually to talk about the section Prepare. So an awful lot of what Felix has said already seamlessly slides into the Prepare section. But there are some key issues to pick up. Within the Prepare section, first things first, and it might seem really so obvious as it doesn't need talking about, make sure it's part of your communication planning, social media or crisis communication planning. The reason for saying that is obviously it was the new kid on the block. And for those of you who can't imagine a world without social media, there will be lots of senior leaders within organizations who perhaps don't choose to use it themselves and therefore don't understand the relevance and importance even now of having social media as integrated within your crisis communications planning. And crises is not the time, when you've got a crisis, it's not the time to find out that you didn't prepare. So some of the headings we've got, which is, have you included it in your crisis communications plan? Have you trained and planned for who will handle social media? And have you considered the impact of operating across different time zones, if that's relevant for your organization or for your clients? And have you prepared your social media channels in advance? So this really is the tip of the iceberg, and it's literally just over a page in the guide. But if you're really approaching this with anything like the degree of rigor that's needed, it will take huge amounts of time to get right, because the most important thing in the preparation is to get internal buy-in. Now, if you're an external agency or if you're an in-house team, you have to have buy-in. And if you don't have the buy-in, which is a key part of the preparation stage, then you're going to have a degree of nervousness and lack of confidence around management of social media, which unfortunately ultimately usually leads to a negative outcome. So what I tend to talk about when I talk to clients about preparation is the 3 S's: source, sector, and stakeholder. So source, by that we mean, is the source of the crisis potentially internal or external? So the sort of internal sources could be ethics and integrity, behavior of key members of staff, product or service failure. And we've got examples on our blogs about all of these things, actually. And our blog repository is a great way to get some ideas about how you might prepare. Then we've got sector. So some of people on this webinar will be operating in highly regulated sectors or in the public sector. And the way you prepare for that will be quite different to somebody who works in a highly commercial environment where the last thing you want to do is to talk to somebody in a rival company about how they manage things. So there's still loads of information out there, but obviously it's going to be a lot easier if you've got a collegiate approach to sector issues. By that, I mean, for example, if you were to have in the public sector, there's possibly somebody here from a police force. There's many examples recently of crises within police force of handling and ethics and integrity. All of these things come into it. And then, of course, the stakeholder, that's the final S. What do your stakeholders think? And I know that Felix touched on this in Mitigate. but what your stakeholders actually think of you is going to be crucial to getting the message right. I'm going to leave it there because there is just so much to the prepare aspect. I encourage you to read the guide. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. Be delighted to pick up on any Q&As later. If you want to make a comment, please put it in the chat. But thank you for the opportunity just to share my thoughts on the part of the guide that I prepared. I'm just going to hand back to Felix now.
Felix, you're on mute.
Sorry. One part of the prepare section is the post model, which you have contributed to, Chris. And just before we're jumping into that, please ignore that Chris, it says ramp up. She will come there soon. We are still on prepare. And even before we're jumping into the post model, Chris, in the guide, you have included some case studies, guest offers. What can people expect in this guide?
Well, case studies are the meat and drink, really, of crisis communication. But I just want to add one little caveat, because I think it's important to remember that when we read a case study, we were never actually in the room when that crisis happened. And I'm saying that because in my old role, when I looked after public relations for Barclays, it was quite common for me to turn up at a conference and find that I was the case study. Spend the whole time wanting to shout at the stage and say, well, that's not quite true, that's not quite true. So, with that caveat, I think case studies give us a good insight into how particular organisations have approached crisis. So I've selected 4 that I thought had good lessons that we could learn from. One, for example, that I'm sure many people will be familiar with is the United Airlines issue, when United Airlines had overbooked a flight and ended up dragging someone off the flight. And I think the lesson there for us is, what operational procedures do we have that, if they were ever to be filmed and uploaded, could create problems. There was another example a few years back of Starbucks, who used to have a tap running in the background at every single one of their outlets until it was filmed, uploaded, and of course people observed, well, in a time when we're concerned about the environment, should we have a tap running all the time? So I think there's a lesson there for us to kind of run that camera test, as it were, over our organisations. I have put in a good example as well, because many crisis case studies are negative ones, but I put in a good example. This is Slack, the social media, internal comms social media channel I'm describing it as. And I thought when they had a serious outage back in 2022, they seem to have had a playbook ready in the way that Sarah's just been talking about, in terms of being prepared. And I thought how they managed their tone of voice was really interesting. And I think getting that tone of voice right, is the tone of voice going to be different in a crisis from how it normally is for you? These are things to think about in advance. Slack one, had some useful lessons for us all.
Yeah, I love
post model, Felix. The post model is I'm putting my academic hat on here. This is Lee and Burnoff, their model, which really helps us decide which social media channels we should be on. Picking up your point, Felix, there are so many, and there are new ones coming along all the time. We have limited time, limited resourcing, and so on. So the post model is P for people. Where are your people? Where are your stakeholders going to actually be? But I think you can put a slight crisis twist on the post model. And there's evidence to suggest that during a crisis, people's behavior changes. And we saw this during COVID. It's been widely written about for years that the mainstream media is in decline. But during COVID, people went back to the mainstream media, went back to the BBC, they went back to those trusted old brands. So I think it's important to think in a crisis, well, before that, you've made decisions from a channel point of view where you want to be. Is that going to change? And then O is for objectives. Some channels are better or seem to work better than others when it comes to a crisis. For example, there's a lot of experimentation at the moment with using text messages, which we previously had thought of as being old technology. But when it comes to a crisis, text messages in some crises actually seem to work really well. So what are you trying to do? Text messages work with conveying simple, instructing information. So that's something to think about. Strategy, what are you trying to do with your social media during the crisis? Do you want people to do things? Do you want them to engage with you? Do you not want them to engage? Is it about following instructions? So agreeing your strategy up front, particularly with senior management, again, picking up what Sarah has said, so that it's very clear how the organisation would react from a strategic point of view. And then the T is for technology. Once you've decided this, do you have the skills to manage the technology in the way that you would want? Video is often a powerful tool to get across your crisis narrative. But if it isn't something you've done before, then maybe it's something you need to think about in terms of upskilling. So I took the post model and I tried to put a sort of crisis twist on it, as it were. And I can see Catherine's put on in the chat room where you can read more about that.
Do you have any examples from you, either from helping clients or when you were working in-house, that you've used the post model, and like, how did you?
Well, I think I've used it mostly when it's clients trying to work out whether or not to jump on the bandwagon of a new channel. TikTok, for example, is a good one, or indeed, you know, Instagram when it first came out. I mean, you have to remember what drives those channels and whether or not you have the capabilities to really use them in the way that they can be used in the most effective manner. I mean, TikTok, for example, is all about personality. Obviously, it's all about video. And Instagram tends to be, obviously, is much more visual. So I've often sort of said to clients, you think through whether or not you can really feed those beasts, as it were. Some of the best TikTok views I've seen has been in the higher education sector, but that ticks a lot of the boxes from the post, because obviously higher education is about young people. That's where young people are, and they do it very well. There are some real exemplars in the higher education field when it comes to the use of those type of video-based channels.
So if you want to learn more about the post model, read the guide. And with that, I think we're going to jump over to what it says on your background, Chris. Ramp up.
Ramp up, yes. Well, thanks, guys, for this one. We did talk about this section as a committee. I said, well, what point should I make? You know, when do you ramp up? When do you press the button, as it were, on your social media plans? And I got the wonderful answer of it depends. But I think it does depend on so many factors. But in terms of how you can reduce that uncertainty, it's a really great contribution from Paul Quigley of NewsWhip. Other social media listening tools are available, but thank you, Paul, for your piece, because it really made me think. Paul uses this term, you know, set your levels. And I think what the point he was making there is that every organisation faces a certain amount of criticism, or, you know, having a bit of a pop at you. So what is usual? What is business as usual? Now, as a PR person, we have our ideas of what is business as usual because we're sitting at the screen all day, but maybe our senior leaders don't. So I think, again, making sure they understand what is a usual level and what is slightly different. And again, in terms of ramp up, you're putting the academic hat on a little bit. There is a crisis academics talk about something called prodromal, or I describe it as straws in the wind. So when you start seeing those posts beginning to, you know, home in on an issue, there is going to be an element of judgment, but, you know, base your judgment on the setting of levels that you may have that you've done before, and think about scenario planning. Really important. What could happen in terms of social media? What are the issues where you might be exposed? How would that develop? When would it cross into mainstream media, for example? Although by the time it's crossed into mainstream media, you may well have, you know, you're running to catch up, as it were. So doing that scenario planning, thinking about your organization's agenda and the tricky agenda that we all know is out there, the culture wars, for want of a better term, or those hot button issues. So, you know, you've got those two sort of circles. Where do they interlock? Where might you end up being caught up in one of those really difficult topics? How would it emerge? How would it go viral? How would it cross into traditional media? And what could you possibly do at each of those stages? So we talk about that in the guide. So hopefully you'll find that useful. Thanks, Felix. Back to you, I think, for manage.
Back to me, and now we're going into manage. So this section, sorry for not having that highlighted. And in manage, in the guide, it's probably two different parts that we provide suggestions on. The first one is more probably where our brains normally are, the reactive part. So for example, it will be a high inload of messages, most probably. How do you handle that? Who are the persons who will handle that? Is it people that normally handle social media? Is it the crisis communication management team, if they are not normally decided, depending on the size of your organization? It's probably need to go quite down into the detail to make sure that you're actually ready, because it will be much, much bigger and much, much more than you're expecting. And on that part, we are talking about people, you and your colleagues and others that will need to work on this. We are just people. So how do you take care of this high influx of people that are coming in, take care about the welfare? Because it can be really tough being in there. At the same time, how do you answer the messages that are coming in? What do you do? What tone of voice do you have? How can you find this messaging that actually work on social media? Because it is very different from many of the other channels and more traditional channels that we have been used during the years when we were having these conversations. And then the second part, which I think is really exciting and which I think we as a community are not really there yet. Some are, but I think there's quite a few examples where we see that people, organizations are really doing this well. And that is, how can you prepare to utilize the power of social media to support your communication during a crisis? Historically, before the emerging of those platforms, we needed to go for media. And we still really need to, but there are just so many more possibilities to apply the basic and really good crisis communications theories in those new modern channels, where you can talk directly to your stakeholders, if it's customers, clients, others. You can have, how can you ensure that you can have a dialogue, if it's appropriate, during a crisis? There are functions out there at the moment, Q&A functions, video functions, that you also quite can moderate. If something in, you can put in your own questions, what you think is important. How can you, but you need to really think about that before something happens, because when you're in a crisis, you haven't thought about it, it will never be the right moment to start doing something, then it will go wrong. But if you can have a strategy, if you can think about it before a crisis hits, it can be such a powerful tool. And I think one of the case studies that you find in the guide, the Slack model, I think is such a brilliant example on how you can do this. Over to next section, we're going with pace here. I hope you think that's good. To Rod and Recover.
Thank you very much. Yes, just joining this motley crew. So I'm Rod Cartwright, Special Advisor to the network. Great to have so many of you here. I wanted to echo what others said about our guest contributors. So Philippe Bormans, who added an excellent thing on predictive analytics. Chris had already mentioned Paul Quigley from Newswhip, who did a really good section on how you use technology to understand the nature of an evolving crisis. Other tools are available, as Chris says. And Shani Lynn, then, who's added her considerable expertise in misinformation and disinformation. So I just wanted to add other people's thanks to those great guest contributors. In terms of the recovery phase, now in the first skills guide, which of course every single one of you will have read and have by your bedside table every evening, we noted that the recovery phase can be every bit as important as the other four phases. And just to quote the original thing, we said that many organizations miss out on the invaluable opportunity to learn from a crisis and to see through actions and communication undertaken in the teeth of this crisis. And it's really important to remember, and we discussed this on the last session at the end of September, that a crisis is only ever a turning point as rich in opportunity as it is in risk. And so much about where you end up on the risk versus opportunity scale is a function not of just how you behave and communicate during the crisis, but how you prepare and how you recover. So you'll see in the guide, we point out that having a really structured recovery phase is even more important from highly social media-centric crises, because very often social media act, if you like, as a proxy for stakeholder sentiment and a guide to it in the short, medium, and long term. And you'll see a quote from Kate Hartley's book, Communicate in a Crisis, where she says, thinking the crisis is over just because it's gone quiet is a mistake. You may be handling queries on social media relating to crisis for months after. And I think, if you don't believe us, even the government communication services own crisis comms operating model primer has recover as the 6th stage, and GCS says communication has an important role in rebuilding trust and confidence, including capturing learnings and updating structures. So our work in this space is informed by other, frankly, world-leading work in the crisis space, in this case from GCS. And the other thing we're at pains to point out, again, for social media heavy crises, you need to remember that the reputational and relationship impact of a crisis continue long after the crisis has appeared to die down. And we talked in the last session about the idea of not just thinking about a return to operational business as usual, but thinking about returning to reputation as usual, not just thinking about operational and business continuity, but thinking about reputational and relationship continuity. And that's where the recovery phase really comes in. And as Felix says, the recovery phase starts long before the post-crisis period itself, because your ability to recover hinges on how well you prepared, and as Chris said, that bank, if you like, of trusted relationships and goodwill that you carry going into a crisis. So put simply, recovery is a function not just of your behavior and comms during the crisis, but of the extent of your preparedness and the extent of that bank of goodwill and trusted relationships. So that's why recovery is so fundamental. Felix.
Thank you, Rod. And we are very sorry for the quality of Rod's video. There seem to be some problems. I'm not sure why it's just on the big. He has beautiful headshots on our website if you're really keen and see what Rod looks like. And that are all the 5 stages of the guide. As other colleagues is talking about, we've had some really great guest contributions in the guide, and one of them is you, Lucy. Who are you?
Hi, so I am Lucy Salvage. I am currently Digital Communications Advisor for the LGA. Previously, I have been a Communications Officer at Wealdon District Council, so I have a lot of local government experience particularly. And I've also worked for the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, managing their social media. So yeah, across all of those 3 things, got quite a lot of experience in dealing with social media crises in particular.
And what's LGA for the people who don't know it?
Oh, I'm so sorry, the Local Government Association.
Thank you. So to the guide, you have contributed with a really great social media appendix to a crisis communication plan. What is it? What can people expect to find?
So really, in the appendix, it's a bit more of a detailed structure of what a crisis communications plan or social media crisis communications plan should look like, and it's really an addendum to your overarching crisis communications plan. So it's I think because social media is it's its own beast, isn't it? So it can't really be covered off just by the generic communications plan. It needs to be considered on its own. So I think it really needs its own crisis plan. So this appendix particularly just outlines who's responsible for social media during a crisis, and those procedures and sign-off processes that you're likely to need. And also just give some hints and tips as well about what your initial response should be, and all of those things that we've just discussed as well about resolution and recovery, and also whilst during the crisis, what your public response could look like, and also ongoing monitoring and adjustment. And there's a really helpful timetable within the appendix as well, which lists, because what a lot of people don't realise is I think they get caught up so much in the crisis that they don't consider the timeline of the communications that should go out on social. Those first couple of hours are quite critical. So there is it's on page 29. There is a really helpful table which lists out A to E what your timeline should be for the duration of any social media crises that you're dealing with.
And I think that's so one thing that I think is so important when it comes to talking about crisis communication on social media is that how can you be quick?
Yes.
It's such a crucial thing. And I think many of organizations, you need to have different stakeholders approving things. And you don't have time for that when it comes to social media and modern crisis communication. And on that, talking about that, like what are your advice in the different organizations you have been? How can you ensure that you can be quick on social media when you're coming into a crisis?
Yeah, so I'll just cover off a couple of the questions that are relevant here that have come in on the chat. So there's been some questions about whether it's useful to use template holding messaging, and also from a public sector point of view, the fact that there could be so many different issues and scenarios that it's quite impossible to have a template for all of those. My advice to that would be to not so much those messages later on once you've actually established what the crisis is, because obviously then they are going to be much more detailed and they're going to be much more specific, and you can't really plan for those. But you can certainly, and you should most definitely, plan for your initial response. And a lot of the time that's only going to be the fact that you've actually acknowledged that there is a crisis and that there is something happening. Because quite often on social media, as I'm sure people are well aware and have seen, things can just things can take off really, really quickly, and not only does having that initial response within the first hour, really, I'd say either 30 minutes to an hour, although the guide does say between the first 1 to 2 hours, which is more than acceptable. But just as soon as you can, regardless of not of whether you're able to establish the facts, just the fact that there is an actual crisis happening, just to put out that statement which says we are aware that something is happening. A bit like very much like what Slack did. They didn't know what the issue was specifically, but they knew that there was an issue. So that was really key and really important that they actually acknowledged that. 2 reasons. It meant that it stopped there an influx of comments coming in from outside to say, Slack, there's an issue, what are you doing about it? So it managed the influx of people coming in, so that it meant that the pressure was taken off from the likes of customer services or other professionals, so that they were able to actually then use their time in finding out what the crisis was about, and they weren't having to firefight and deal with all these comments. And secondly, it just shows that you're that you care, that you're on top of things, and again, it's all about that kind of trust and that authority. So yeah.
I think, Lucy, it's also important for the organisation to establish itself as the 100%. Best source of information, even if you're only, as you say, confirming what people may already know.
I've been in a lot of situations where, and I'm sure, this isn't new to anybody who's in comms, but we quite often have to go such a rigorous sign-off process. And I think, and in public sectors particularly, when a crisis happens, there's so much desire from particularly higher management to want to know and establish every single minute little detail, and in a crisis situation you just can't do that. So I think there's a place as well for us as communicators to actually kind of be brave and say, look, we don't have all of the facts, but what we can do is just acknowledge that there is a situation, and you might really need to push for that, but that is really important, that you don't need to know every single little thing before you can actually come out and say, look, there is a problem. And I think my main point is to say it is okay, as we've seen with Slack, it is perfectly okay to admit that you don't know what the issue is, but just the fact that there is one. And I think from that point on, so long as then in your communications, it's no good just posting that and then not posting anything else for about 2 or 3 hours. so long as you're then consistent in your messaging and you're consistently drip feeding updates, I think it's perfectly fine in the first instance to say that you don't know what the problem is, but you're looking into it. And in terms of, sorry, Felix, going back to your point about speed, for me, a lot of that is about as well, again, in your preparation and mitigation, just having training for people outside of your core communications team, particularly not so much writing messages and content, because obviously that's for us communications professionals to do, but they can certainly, other people outside of your team can certainly be useful if they're tech savvy, particularly in terms of providing you with monitoring support on social and also responding to just general comments if necessary, because what can particularly be really difficult in a crisis is especially if you're a really small communications team, is that you're doing that, you're in firefighting mode and trying to keep up to date and on all the monitoring and getting back to people and replying to all the comments, that you're not then able to actually focus on the crisis in hand and delivering the messaging. So if you can, identify people outside of your regular team, train them up on social media to be able to just post a comment, know how to monitor hashtags and all of that kind of thing. And again, there are within your social media management tools, if you do sign up to those, you can easily assign tasks to people and things like that. But it just means that then just building extra resilience within the team, so that then when a crisis hits, you're protecting your core team and that they can actually focus on delivering the messaging.
Thank you, Lucy.
Right, Felix, do you mind if I just pick up on a crucial point from what Chris and Lucy have been talking about, which is speed in the misinformation world? And the reason I think it's so important to read Shoni's contribution is at the Eco Global Summit in Istanbul last week, if you stripped away everything, mis and disinformation were the thing that unifies the concerns of all communicators. And I think that what Lucy says about balancing, that we say in crisis training, the fact to your friends, but at the same time, you have to establish yourself as the single source of truth. And I think if people didn't see, there's a very good BBC Storyville documentary called War Game, where they essentially do a war game where they extrapolate January the 6th to see what would happen if it got much worse. And the insurgents, the role players, were, as they said, flooding the space with lies. So I think that balance in being the single source of truth in a very fast moving misinformation and disinformation heavy environment is really, really critical.
Yes, the BBC did another piece recently as well, Rod, on the Southport riots and tracking the social media journey, as it were. It's absolutely fascinating. So if you haven't read that, it's on BBC's news website. So it's just really interesting to track how a single post really becomes an issue, and the sort of kind of piling, as it were, that follows that. So there's quite a lot out there, a lot of good work being done, isn't there? A lot of really interesting work. So thank you to Shoni for her piece in the guide.
And
if I could just, sorry, Felix.
No, it's okay. We will jump forward. If you have any questions, this is the chance to put them in the Q&A. We've had some questions connected to training, crisis simulation. Rod, you are quite involved in a company called Polpeo, who offers really good, fancy real-life simulations. We've also had them here on the network. But what would your advice be if you're maybe not really on the stage where you can take in a crisis simulations company to really come in and make a real-life run through a crisis? What would you like? Where should you start with the training and simulation?
Absolutely. And I think the starting point is as much attitudinal as it is practical. In reply to something Bruce said, I shared in the chat a piece I wrote on what I call critical human infrastructure, because I think that, and we discussed it on the last session as well, it's very easy to think that if you have a risk system, you have materials, you have processes, you're ready. You are not. You're only ready when your people are ready. So I think that even if you can't do a full-scale digital stress test, Polpeo do them, Conductor do them, Social Simulator do them, just to give the full panoply of things available, having training that gets people into the crisis mindset, helps them understand what the definitions are, what the difference between an issue and a crisis is, looks at live examples, puts them through a quick desktop exercise. That sort of training that stops short of a full simulation, I think, is vital. And the key is to put not just your comms function, but as many executives as possible through, because at the end of the day, responding to a crisis is a full organization team sport. So I think the training needs to be rounded in terms of participation rather than just being the comms function.
Another question, which maybe you can answer, Lucy, is that Lizzie, thank you so much for the questions, and even more thank you for reading the guide so quickly or scrolling it through. This is wondering about the framework connected to online abuse, and she's seen in some incidences of crisis unfolding on social media, staff, particularly senior staff, come under target for specific trolling and online abuse, can have huge impacts.
Yeah, so again, as Rod just alluded to, dealing with a social media crisis, and particularly in terms of the mitigation side of things, it is an organisational responsibility and not just a communications team responsibility. So what, in response to what Lizzie is asking, I have seen this happen where social media crises have unfolded due to what either a board member or a member of staff, it's kind of been self-inflicted, for want of a better phrase. So what we can do to mitigate that risk is to make sure that you do supplement your social media crisis plan with organisational staff training on social media that covers off basic do's and don'ts and things like that, but also that links to some of the legalities and makes people aware of the consequences of actually if they say or do something on social media that could potentially have harmful consequences for the reputation of a company. And it's really important for me whenever I've gone into a new role, I've made sure that there's a suite of governance documents implemented around this. So, for example, I would definitely make sure that you have an acceptable use policy. So what an acceptable use policy does is actually outlines what you will do as an organisation if you experience any trolling behaviour or any abusive behaviour, and that is something that can actually be published on your website for members of the public to see. And what that does is it really, not only does it give you a clear guide as to what you will actually do in that situation, but it also signals to the public as well as to what you will and won't accept, so that when you do if you encounter that behavior, you can signpost to that policy, and that just gives you a bit of support. Also, you should have in place an HR policy, and this is particularly in relation to staff. So an HR policy would talk about responsibilities of who's responsible for using social in your organisation, general guidelines, the acceptable use of company accounts, and the use of personal accounts. Because I think what's really clear, in order to mitigate a social media crisis, it's really important that staff recognise as well that they are representatives of the company, even when they are using their personal social media accounts. So it's no, you see a lot of people saying, these are my views and my views only, and not the view of my company. Well, unfortunately, if you've said something on social, and you know that is going to impact who you work for potentially. And also
Funny
the
enough,
HR
Lucy, I just googled what you were saying about a governance document, and it took me straight to the local government association's document.
Oh, well, that's good. I can't claim that I wrote that one.
I'll pop it in the chat.
But I'm happy to, I can send round some examples. That's not a problem. And then also you should have a separate communications protocol for using social, which would be more really for the for those within the team who are using social, but also for any member of staff really who's using social media. So that would cover off things like social media in the law, how to handle criticism and abuse, the conduct of staff and representatives and what's expected. So yeah, having those things in place should really help make sure that any of your board members or members of staff don't get you into any trouble on social. So I hope that's helpful.
And I think one point for me to add, that's it's at least my experience on working in organization, and I also had some online abuse. And sometimes just when it's one post out there, like someone posting you get so panicking the organization because it's out there, they're talking about the person. But something that we also talk about in the guide is you need to try to understand when something is actually big and is a crisis, and when something is just published on social media.
Yeah.
So many instances when someone is posting something on there, you see it, no one else will see it. The same thing to sometimes there's so many instances where it's something is being talked about quite a lot, but it's just trolls, or it is a very limited circle of people talking about it. So really try to do that strategic thinking in advance of what is actually when something is a crisis and is a problem for us, and what are just other things that maybe probably is more internal stakeholder management to ensure that people understand the width and breadth of what's happening. And we do also in the guide have one section by Fiona Lynn on misinformation and disinformation, which of course just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I think last point, you will not find the answer to every question in this guide. We've tried to cover top line, and we could have done it 150 pages. It would be hard as volunteers. So like, see this as a starting point. There are more questions you need to ask yourself. Dependent on your organization, there are things that you will need to prepare that's not covered in the guide. So you will need your professional eye. And hopefully join our other ones where we'll talk even more about stuff like this. We have one other question from Tim. Let's talk about the importance of flow of communication for an organization and making sure that you as a comms team actually get the information from your internal stakeholders to make sure that you are prepared for the unexpected.
Can I have a run at that? Because it builds on what we were talking about earlier on. If you expect the flow of information to work, if you try and get the flow of information to work in the middle of a crisis, it won't work. It's back to this preparedness phase where, you know, they say a family that eats together stays together, or whatever, you know, an organization that prepares together stays together. So the whole question of information flow should be fundamental to the way in which you do risk assessment, scenario planning, preparation and training, because there should be no surprises when you phone somebody up and say, I need this information. They should kind of already know. So I think the idea that you are waiting to get information flow going when the crisis has hit, again, you are frankly slightly too late, is my personal take and experience on that.
We are running out of time. Any last word from the panelists that you would want to add that you don't think we've covered? Or
so I'm just popping up, Felix, just to say, all I would say is to everybody and anyone who's joined us today, you've made a great start by joining us. But before you move on to your next task today, just make a note of a date and time when you're actually going to start reviewing what you've got in place already and deciding if it's fit for purpose, because it's one of those things that you think, you hope it will never come, but actually it's far better to plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Can I quickly, Felix, there's one really good question in the chat from David, I think it is, about whether the Online Safety Act and the EU Digital Services Act are helpful or whether they're too slow moving. I think it's great that there's more legislation and regulation in place, but for anyone who's ever tried to get a comment taken down from Google reviews, or anyone who's ever tried to get something taken off Trustpilot because it's untrue, the idea that legislation alone will change the super tanker that is the tech giant's attitudes toward accuracy and towards ethical screening of what's up there, honestly, for me, is for the bees. So I think you have to assume that regardless of the state of legislation and regulation, you're still going to need to assume that the tech giants will be slow moving and the takedowns will remain difficult, even in a new legislative environment.
And with that, thank you all the panelists. There will be a blog post about this on our website. Where we also will capture some of the links that's been in here. And with that, I'm handing over to Catherine.
Okay, thank you very much, Felix, and thank you, everybody. Just to pick up on a point Felix made as well, there are probably more questions all of you do have. So today is not the end by any means. The guide is a starter for 10, really. We think it's pretty comprehensive, but I mean, you can't possibly cover everything in a guide of 32 pages. So we encourage you to keep coming along to our open house sessions. We're going to have another one early next year to talk to us and raise any questions you might have. Also, because people have been kindly saying that they'd quite like to meet us in person and put questions to us, in a sort of live, face-to-face, real environment, we are thinking of starting an occasional series of Crisis Comms meetups. So that will be over a drink in a pub, I expect, somewhere in central London. So I hope you will join us for those. We'll be letting you have further information about that before too long. So that's all for now, and we wanted to thank you all so much for coming today. We do appreciate your support and everything you do to support and encourage us. We're here for you. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we'll see you soon, I hope. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.